A German officer steps through the ruins of Caen in August 1944. The city is blasted apart, stone dust in the air, streets turned into broken rock. In moments like that, people stop pretending. And in private writings and post-war interviews, a pattern shows up again and again. By late in the war, a lot of German veterans no longer talked about British soldiers like they were soft or second-rate. They talked like men who had learned the hard way. Now, quick heads up. If your mental picture is Germans feared the Soviets, respected the Americans, and laughed at the British, you're not alone. That's the version that became popular because it's simple, it fits neat stereotypes, and it's also misleading because when you dig into what German troops actually reported over the years, field summaries, letters that got censored, POW interrogations, unit diaries, you keep finding the same surprise. The British weren't dismissed by experienced German units in 1944 and 1945, not at all. In fact, in the West, a lot of German veterans came to see British units as the kind of opponent you do not want to draw on the map. If you're into WWII stories that cut through the myths, make sure you're subscribed. This one flips the usual script, and it matters. But here's the real question. How did Germany go from mocking Britain's army in 1940 to treating British formations like a serious danger by the end of the war? To understand that, we have to rewind to the moment German soldiers felt unstoppable, back when they honestly believed the British were a punchline. 1940. Winning so fast it feels unreal. In the spring of 1940, the German army is doing exactly what it was built to do. Fast campaigns. Shock. Collapse. Poland is beaten in weeks. Denmark falls almost instantly. Norway gets taken after fighting, but it doesn't derail the machine. Then comes the big one, France. And France isn't supposed to fall quickly, not in German memory. In the last war, France had held Germany in a brutal grind for years, so when France collapses in about 6 weeks, German soldiers react with a mix of disbelief and swagger. You see it in how they describe it, like the world's toughest door got kicked open, and it wasn't even that hard. And right in that moment, the British get tagged with a story that sticks, because the British Expeditionary Force fights, gets pushed back, and ends up retreating to the coast. Dunkirk becomes the image German soldiers remember. Allied troops backed against the sea, smoke in the sky, ships and small boats pulling people off the beach. From a distance, it looks like Britain tried land warfare and failed. Then it went home. And for German troops in 1940, that proved what they already wanted to believe. Britain was a naval power, not a serious ground opponent. A country of ships, trade routes, and empire. Not a nation built for modern continental war. German propaganda then pours gasoline on it. It doesn't just say Britain lost. It says Britain can't fight, that British soldiers are weak, that their morale is broken, that they'll eventually give up and negotiate once they realize they're trapped. If you're a German soldier in 1940, that message feels believable because it matches what you think you saw. But here's the detail that matters, and it's one German troops noticed, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. Dunkirk wasn't a total collapse. Yes, it was a retreat. Yes, it was a defeat. But it was also an organized withdrawal under pressure, held together by discipline. Rear guards fought delaying actions. Units tried to keep order while the situation was falling apart. And Britain managed to evacuate hundreds of thousands of troops, many of them trained soldiers who would fight again later. To German troops watching from the outside, evacuation still looked like running. But the professionalism underneath it was a warning sign. And in 1940, that warning gets shrugged off. Summer 1940, confidence turns into certainty. After France, German assessments of Britain's army get downright dismissive. The thinking goes like this. Britain is protected by the Channel and the Royal Navy, sure, but on land, Britain's army has taken a public punch. It's shaken. It's not built for this kind of war. If Germany can get across the water, the ground fight will be short. That belief is one reason German planners could talk seriously about invading Britain. If you assume the enemy is mentally broken, you plan for light resistance. You expect surrender once the shock lands. And then something happens that ruins the whole fantasy. Britain doesn't fold. Instead of negotiating, Britain keeps fighting, day after day, night after night, during the air campaign that becomes the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. German air crews fly missions expecting to see a country on its knees. But what they keep encountering is a country still operating, defenses still firing, factories still producing, people still working, cities still functioning, even after heavy damage. Whatever the Germans thought Dunkirk meant, Britain doesn't act like a nation quitting. And by late 1940, the invasion plan gets postponed and then effectively shelved. German forces shift attention elsewhere: the Balkans, the Mediterranean, North Africa, and eventually the Soviet Union. Britain, supposedly finished, stays in the war. That creates the first crack in German certainty. But here's the thing. Up to this point, German soldiers still haven't had the kind of sustained ground combat that truly measures an opponent. France ended in a retreat and evacuation. The Battle of Britain is in the air. The real test, the place where German and British troops would clash for months, learn each other's habits, and form lasting opinions, was still ahead. And it happened somewhere many German troops barely knew existed on a map: a harsh, flat desert on the edge of the Mediterranean, North Africa, where the myth starts to die. In early 1941, German forces arrive in North Africa to support Italian troops that have been getting pushed around. The goal is clear: stabilize the front, hit back, and regain control of key territory in Libya. The commander most people remember is Erwin Rommel, and early on the German side feels confident. They expect a repeat of France, just with sand instead of fields. At first, it kind of looks like that. German units move aggressively, British forces give ground, towns change hands. Headlines in Germany celebrate. The old story tries to come back. See, Britain can't fight. But then, the desert starts teaching lessons. German commanders are used to a certain rhythm. When a force is beaten, it falls apart. It flees. It loses coordination. You can chase it down and finish it. The British in the desert often don't do that. They pull back, yes, but they don't always dissolve. They reform. They set up again. They're waiting in new positions. And in a place with huge distances and open terrain, British mobility and scouting become a serious problem. German soldiers start writing about something that bothers them. The British are harder to pin down than expected. They don't always fight to hold ground the way German doctrine expects. Sometimes they fight to punish you, disrupt you, and then vanish before you can trap them. It's not magic, it's adaptation. A lot of British units in the desert are learning fast because they have to. Some have already fought the Italians in earlier rounds of the campaign. They're figuring out supply, movement, and how to use the terrain. They also understand something the desert makes brutally clear: if you sit still and get found, you get smashed. So they move, they probe, they hit vulnerable points like supply lines. They force German units to constantly guard their rear and flanks. And that chips away at German confidence because it's not what they were promised. Then comes the moment that really sticks in German memory: Tobruk. The siege that won't end. Tobruk becomes a symbol, and not in a way Germany expected. A garrison, British and Commonwealth troops, including a large Australian component early in the siege, ends up surrounded. On paper, this should be a quick win for the Axis. The defenders are cut off. They're outnumbered. They're under constant pressure. German intelligence expects the place to fall fast. Instead, the siege drags on for months, about 8 months in total in 1941. That matters because it forces German troops to confront something they can't propaganda away: endurance. The defenders don't collapse on schedule. They don't surrender just because it's logical. They raid out. They repair. They keep fighting. They absorb attacks that should have broken them. And this does something psychological to the attacker. If your entire worldview says enemy morale eventually cracks under enough pressure, Tobruk is deeply unsettling. It suggests the British aren't reacting the way you planned for. And if you can't predict how the enemy breaks, you can't rely on fear and pressure to finish the job. This is where German descriptions start to shift. Not because German troops suddenly think British soldiers are superhuman. They don't. They still believe German weapons and tactics can win fights. But they start admitting a harder truth: British units can take punishment and keep operating. They can lose ground and still come back organized. They can get hammered and still respond professionally. And from a soldier's point of view, that is dangerous because it means the war doesn't end cleanly. It means you're going to have to do this over and over and over without the enemy conveniently collapsing like the story promised. By mid-1942, German reports and attitudes are noticeably different from 1940. Weak doesn't fit anymore. Outdated doesn't fully fit. The tone shifts toward words like stubborn, disciplined, and increasingly capable. And that's when another reality sets in, one the Germans won't fully appreciate until it hits them in the face. While the desert is chewing everyone up, the British are learning. Not learning in a dramatic, movie-style way. Learning the hard way, through mistakes, after-action reports, replacements coming in, tactics being refined, coordination getting tighter, slow, methodical improvement. And if there's one thing that should make any experienced soldier nervous, it's an opponent who doesn't just survive setbacks, but studies them. Because once that kind of army stops backing up, it doesn't just try again, it comes back sharper. And that brings us to the next turning point, the moment German troops stop thinking, we can handle these guys, and start thinking, this is going to be brutal. Because in late 1942, the British 8th Army stops retreating. And when that happens, German perceptions of British soldiers change permanently. That's where we're headed in Part 2. By late 1942, the desert has done something that propaganda never could. It has forced German soldiers to judge the British based on results, not rumors. For almost 2 years, German units in North Africa have watched the same pattern repeat. The British take hits, fall back, regroup, and come back organized. They don't collapse on schedule. They don't panic the way weak armies are supposed to panic. And every time Germany thinks it has them figured out, the British show up with a new answer. That's the part German veterans start to respect and fear, because it signals something worse than stubbornness. It signals improvement. The shift from clever moves to raw pressure. In early desert fighting, German officers are used to wars that swing fast, big maneuvers, breakthroughs, dramatic gains. That style fits the legend of Blitzkrieg. Strike hard, move fast, break the enemy's will. But the British in the desert don't always give you that kind of clean fight. And by 1942, the British 8th Army is changing how it fights. Instead of trying to win by brilliance, it starts trying to win by certainty. Not a flashy plan, not a heroic gamble. A system. If a position is strong, the British don't always rush it. They isolate it. They map it. They bring up guns. They keep hitting it until it stops functioning. Then they move on to the next problem. German troops notice this because it's the opposite of what they've been told. They were taught that British leadership was slow and outdated, that British coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery would be clumsy, that British attacks would be poorly timed and easy to disrupt. In 1942, those assumptions start getting people killed. El Alamein. When the British stop backing up, the Desert Campaign has a lot of battles, but one moment stands out as the psychological turning point. The battles around El Alamein in Egypt in the fall of 1942. German and Italian forces have pushed deep into North Africa. Supplies are stretched. Everyone is exhausted. It's the kind of situation where one side expects the other to break first. But the British don't break. They build. They prepare. And when they attack, German veterans describe it in the same kind of language you see when soldiers talk about surviving a storm. Because at El Alamein, the British bring something the Germans don't expect at that scale in the desert. Sustained, organized firepower, especially artillery, applied with patience, not a quick punch, a long crush. The battlefield becomes a routine of pressure, heavy bombardment, careful advances, mines cleared, new lines formed, more bombardment, more advances. When German units try to counterattack, they run into defenses that are already set up. When German armor tries to exploit openings, anti-tank guns and artillery are positioned to meet them. The key point isn't that the British suddenly become better humans or braver men. The key point is that they begin operating like a machine that has learned the job. German soldiers can handle aggression. They can handle an enemy that takes wild risks. That's predictable. You can plan around it. What shakes them is an enemy that doesn't rush, doesn't overreach, and doesn't stop. And in the desert, where you can often see for miles, that kind of system is terrifying because you can watch it coming and still not be able to prevent it. El Alamein doesn't end the war in North Africa instantly, but it changes the direction of the campaign. Axis forces begin pulling back across Libya, and as they retreat, they see the same British method again and again: steady advances, constant pressure, careful coordination. No drama, just results. Tunisia. The lesson gets confirmed. By early 1943, North Africa is closing in. Axis troops are being squeezed from multiple directions as Allied forces converge on Tunisia. For German survivors, this final stage leaves a lasting impression, not because every British action is perfect, but because the British are consistently difficult to exploit. They don't offer as many easy mistakes. They don't throw away units in reckless charges. They're cautious in a way that frustrates German veterans who are trained to look for openings. And when British forces do attack, they often do it with the same pattern: artillery, armor, infantry, engineering support, working together. Again, it's not about flashy genius. It's about a process that keeps improving. After Tunisia, a lot of German troops who survive captivity carry a private conclusion. The British Army they met in 1942-43 is not the British Army they assumed existed in 1940, not even close. And now comes the part that matters for Europe, because the British aren't staying in the desert, they're coming north. And they're bringing their experience with them. Sicily. Germans see two different Allied styles, summer 1943. The Allies invade Sicily. On the German side, this is a big deal because it forces German defenders to face large Allied ground forces in the Mediterranean under conditions that are closer to Europe. It's not endless open desert anymore. It's rougher terrain, narrow roads, towns, hills, and defensive positions that can be held. And in Sicily, German commanders get to compare two Allied styles side by side. American units often fight with speed, confidence, and heavy firepower. They can hit hard, they can push aggressively, but they're also newer to this kind of large Mediterranean ground campaign. They can be more predictable. They can make errors German veterans know how to punish. Against the British, German reports tend to emphasize something different. The British are methodical. When they run into a strong point, they don't always slam into it immediately. They probe it, they test it, they identify the weak points and the weapons. They bring in artillery and supporting arms. Then they take the position when the math is in their favor. For German defenders, that can feel worse than being attacked by a reckless opponent, because reckless opponents sometimes hand you opportunities. A careful opponent can make you feel like you're being slowly disassembled. In Sicily, German troops also notice British reconnaissance and patrol work. It's not just big battles, it's the daily pressure, patrols, small attacks, constant contact, keeping defenders tense and worn down. Sicily falls in a matter of weeks. The campaign has chaos, bad weather, tough terrain, and shifting fronts. But the German takeaway is blunt. British units in this theater are experienced, cautious in the right way, and hard to disrupt. And now comes the bigger test. Italy. Terrain built for defense, until the British treat it like a project the Italian campaign should, in theory, favor the German defenders. Italy is a defender's map: mountains, rivers, narrow valleys, limited roads, positions you can fortify. German engineers and commanders build layered defensive lines designed to slow the Allies and make them pay for every mile. This is where German confidence tries to return. The logic is simple. Even if the British learned in the desert, mountains are different. The old British grind won't work as well here. Tanks can't easily maneuver. Supply is harder. Weather is worse. There are choke points everywhere. Then the British do something that messes with German assumptions again. They treat the terrain like an engineering problem. Rivers are supposed to slow armies. The British build crossings under fire, at night, with small boats, bridging equipment, and coordinated support. German troops watch them appear on the far bank faster than expected, establishing positions before defenders can concentrate fire. Mountain slopes and narrow roads are supposed to limit armor. British units keep finding ways to bring tanks forward anyway, sometimes slowly, sometimes with heavy effort, using engineers to improve routes and push equipment into places German doctrine says it shouldn't go. This doesn't mean British tanks become magic weapons. It means the British refuse to accept "not possible" as the final answer. And for German defenders, that's a problem because defense is built on predictability. If you can predict where the enemy can't go, you can build your fortress there. When the enemy starts showing up where you thought they couldn't, your whole geometry collapses. Italy becomes a long campaign of lines and rivers, positions built to hold, then eventually forced to give way. The Germans fight hard. Some units in Italy are elite. Many have experience from other fronts, but even strong defenders begin describing the British as relentless in a different way than the Americans. Not reckless, persistent. The British keep coming back after setbacks. They keep returning with more artillery, better coordination, more engineers, and more patience than defenders want to deal with. Monte Cassino. The grinding war made visible, Monte Cassino becomes one of the most brutal symbols of the Italian campaign. It's not one battle. It's a series of battles around a defensive system anchored in rugged terrain. The Germans hold strong positions and fight stubbornly. Allied attacks struggle. Progress is slow and costly. What German veterans often remember here isn't a single brilliant British move. It's the feeling of being constantly pressured. Even when an attack is stopped, the front doesn't relax. There are patrols. There is artillery. There are repeated efforts from different directions. Time to rest is limited. Repairs are interrupted. The defender's strength erodes. That experience reinforces the reputation forming in German minds. British forces may not always be the fastest, but they are hard to exhaust, and they keep applying force until your position becomes untenable. And then, in 1944, German soldiers in Italy start expressing something that would have sounded insane back in 1940. They don't want to face the British. Not because the British are cruel, or because they commit wild charges, because fighting the British often means a slow, punishing process. Days and weeks of bombardment, patrol pressure, carefully built attacks, and grinding losses that don't produce a dramatic moment where you can turn the tide. It's attrition with professionalism behind it. By spring 1944, German defenses in Italy are strained. Lines still exist, but they're increasingly thin. And the British, along with other Allied forces, keep forcing movement north. Then comes June 1944, and with it, the moment the German soldiers in France have been dreading, whether they admit it or not. Because the British aren't just fighting in Italy anymore. They are about to hit France. And this time, they are not coming back to evacuate. They are coming back to stay. In Part 3, we'll step into Normandy, where British and Canadian forces land, push inland, and then collide with German elite units in battles so brutal that even veterans from the Eastern Front take notes. June 6, 1944. Before sunrise, the coast of Normandy starts shaking under naval gunfire. Inland, airborne troops drop into the dark. Along the beaches, landing craft slam into the surf, and thousands of men step out into a storm of bullets, obstacles, and confusion. This isn't a clean, heroic movie scene. It's messy and violent and chaotic. And yet, by the end of the day, the German defenders have a problem they can't explain away. The Allies are on shore, on every beach, and they're not being thrown back into the sea. For German soldiers watching British and Canadian troops come in, the first shock isn't just the scale, it's the pace. Some German units expected a slow crawl inland, units pinned down, disorganized, bleeding time. Instead, reports coming up the chain describe British forces moving inland faster than anticipated, securing villages and crossroads that German planners assumed would hold for days. That alone doesn't prove anything. The Germans still believe they can contain it. But Normandy isn't one day. Normandy is weeks of close combat, artillery duels, counterattacks, raids, attrition, and nerves being chewed down to nothing. And in that sustained grind, German perceptions of British soldiers complete the transformation that began in North Africa and hardened in Italy. These aren't rookies. The veteran factor. A lot of British troops landing in Normandy in 1944 aren't fresh. They aren't brand new to war. Many have already fought across multiple campaigns, North Africa, Sicily, Italy. They've been under air attack. They've been shelled. They've learned what German armor does, what German infantry does, how German officers react when pressured. They don't need to guess anymore. So when German defenders clash with them in Normandy, they're not just facing manpower, they're facing experience. And experience does a particular kind of damage to an opponent because it removes the hope that the enemy will do something stupid. German tactics in earlier years often depended on exploiting mistakes, panicked retreats, badly coordinated attacks, units that moved without support. Those openings were real, they were deadly. But in 1944, British units are far less likely to hand those openings over for free. The road to Caen, where the fighting becomes a furnace. After the landings, one key objective on the British sector is the city of Caen. It's a major communications hub. Roads and rail lines run through it. For the Germans, it's not just a city, it's a hinge. German high command orders it held. And to hold it, German commanders funnel in some of their best formations, including armored units with experienced crews. Some of these units have fought on the Eastern Front. They've faced Soviet offensives. They've survived brutal conditions. They don't scare easily. But the Caen area becomes a kind of meat grinder anyway. Not because the British pull off one genius trick, because they apply pressure with an intensity that feels modern and merciless. Artillery, airstrikes when conditions allow, naval guns from offshore, tanks working with infantry, engineers clearing obstacles, and repeated operations designed to keep German units under constant stress. German defenders in and around Caen experience something that keeps showing up in their accounts. The British aren't trying to surprise them with drama. They're trying to remove their ability to fight. They reduce positions, they destroy strongpoints, they isolate areas and pound them until movement becomes impossible. Then they advance. Street by street, field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow. For German soldiers, it can feel less like battling an enemy and more like being processed. What scares German armored crews? Germany still has excellent tanks and armored crews in Normandy. Panthers and Tigers are dangerous. German gunnery is often superb. Tactics can still be sharp. So why do some German armored veterans write like British defenses were a trap they couldn't escape? Because by 1944, British anti-tank defense is not just a gun in a field. It's layered. It's planned. There are guns positioned to cover likely approaches. Infantry has anti-tank weapons in concealment. Artillery is on call. Air power exists as a threat, even when it isn't overhead every minute. British units dig in and build depth, so even if one position gets hit, another one opens fire. German tank commanders who were used to breakthroughs, punch through, exploit, run the enemy's rear, often find that British sectors don't break open the same way. When German armor tries to push, it runs into coordinated fires that cut down movement. Even when German units achieve local successes, they struggle to turn them into a wider collapse. And that's the nightmare for a German commander, winning a fight but not winning momentum. Because without momentum, you're just trading strength for ground. And in 1944, Germany can't afford those trades. The psychological effect. No easy mistakes. If you want to understand why German veterans increasingly disliked facing British formations, it often comes down to this. British units in late war Europe are hard to fool and hard to rattle. They patrol aggressively. They react quickly to infiltration attempts. They have strong artillery support. They coordinate with armor. They consolidate gains. They don't rush forward in ways that create easy counterattack opportunities. A German unit may still be able to fight them, even hurt them badly, but to actually stop them, to break them, that's another level, and breaking an enemy is what Germany needs in Normandy, because the Allies are building up faster than Germany can replace losses. The Falaise disaster survival becomes the goal. By August 1944, the front shifts toward collapse. Allied pressure plus American breakthroughs elsewhere begins closing a pocket around large German forces in Normandy. The fighting becomes desperate. The German priority becomes escape. This is where veteran formations get shattered. Units that entered Normandy with thousands of men get ground down into remnants. Tanks are lost. Vehicles are abandoned. Command structure fractures. Morale doesn't always break, but it gets exhausted, worn into something numb. And again, British and Canadian pressure plays its role in this collapse, not necessarily as the only hammer, but as part of the relentless force that keeps closing, keeps cutting routes, keeps attacking positions that must be held for the pocket to stay open. When the remnants finally break out, many are physically out of shape, short on ammunition, missing equipment, and psychologically wrecked. And the lesson a lot of them carry is blunt. If the British latch onto you, they don't let go. Market Garden. The moment Germans can't forget after Normandy. The Allied advance across France is rapid. German units scramble to form new lines. Supply depots are set up and then lost. Positions are prepared and then immediately probed. Then comes September 1944, Operation Market Garden. The plan is ambitious. Airborne landings seize key bridges, while ground forces race up to link up and push into the Netherlands. It's a high-risk operation, and in the end, it fails to achieve the full objective. The bridge at Arnhem isn't held long enough. The corridor gets squeezed. The British airborne units at Arnhem become isolated, but here's the part that matters for our story. German soldiers who fought the British airborne at Arnhem did not walk away feeling relieved. They walked away impressed and, in many cases, shaken, because the British paratroopers, cut off and surrounded, don't fold quickly. They hold positions in battered buildings. They keep fighting even as ammo runs low. They resist longer than German commanders expect. German troops destroy positions and still meet more resistance. They finally overrun some areas only after grinding down defenders who refuse to quit. That is a repeated theme with British troops throughout the war. They may lose an operation, but they don't always lose their composure. And for German high command, the deeper fear is obvious. If Market Garden had fully worked, if the corridor had held, if the bridges had been secured, Germany would have faced a crisis it might not have been able to solve. Arnhem becomes a reminder that British soldiers can be surrounded, punished, and still remain dangerous. Winter 1944 to early 1945, the British keep advancing. As the war enters its final stage, German forces are defending closer and closer to home. Manpower is thin, fuel is scarce, training is rushed, replacement units are often underprepared. Meanwhile, British forces in the Northwest push forward with the same style German veterans have come to recognize: steady movement, heavy fire support, methodical attacks, constant pressure. The British do not need to win fast. They can win by not stopping. German soldiers write and say versions of the same thought. You can slow the British, but stopping them is another thing entirely. They keep coming back with more supplies, more ammunition, more artillery, more engineers, and the same patient approach. This is where the earlier stereotype dies completely. The German image of Britain as soft can't survive being shelled for weeks by British guns, watching British infantry advance into danger with discipline, or seeing British units rebuild momentum after setbacks without collapsing. The final months, why surrendering to the British feels like relief. By spring 1945, Germany is collapsing. The Soviets are coming from the east, the Americans from the west, and the British from the northwest. Resistance becomes uneven, fanatical in some places, thin in others, non-existent in many. Some units still fight hard, others are simply trying to survive. In this period, something shows up in a lot of German accounts. When German soldiers surrender to British forces, many feel relief, not because war is suddenly pleasant, but because surrender to the British often means the fight is over. Fighting them means more days of grinding attrition and pressure you can't reverse. Surrendering means you live. And as German prisoners sit in camps in British-held areas, the talk becomes more honest. They compare fronts. They compare opponents. They talk about what they feared, what they respected, what they dreaded. And across that talk, a conclusion forms that would have sounded ridiculous back in 1940. The British were not the easy enemy propaganda promised. They were, in many ways, the most consistently dangerous opponent Germany faced in the West. Not because they were the most dramatic, but because they were the most relentlessly professional. Part 4 is where we put the full meaning on that word professional and why German veterans kept describing the British as terrifying in a very specific way, different from how they described Americans and Soviets. Because by the end, the fear wasn't about British tanks being the best or British numbers being endless. It was about something worse, an enemy that studies every loss, fixes every weakness, and returns to the same fight smarter than before, until the only logical move left is to quit.